Metroid Other M is the newest entry in the Metroid series, and a major departure from what we've been seeing since the series made its way to the GameCube nearly 8 years ago. Instead of following along with the previous Metroid Prime games, Other M skips ahead a bit and continues on where Super Metroid left off on the Super NES. Not only that, but the gameplay style has been changed almost completely. It's no longer a first-person shooter and instead returns to its roots, sort of. Whether this new style of play is something you'll get into or not is up to you. What I will say is that it's not handled quite as well as it could have been, and overall I was less than enthused when it was all over, which I can't say for any of the Metroid Prime games. Other M opens with a cutscene showing the conclusion of Super Metroid in which Samus defeats Mother Brain. The story picks up right from there as she wakes up on a Galactic Federation ship and soon after receives a distress signal known as Baby's Cry from a nearby dormant vessel. Upon entering the ship, she meets up with a group of Galactic Federation soldiers and, well, you get the point.
Remember me?
Yeah, who doesn't? The story is surprisingly deep, and I'm really not going to try to explain it any further, but I will say that fans of the series should enjoy it for the most part. The game is very heavy on cutscenes and dialogue and explains itself pretty well, although it can be a bit overdramatic at times and it does have a tendency to drag on unnecessarily. It is a pretty interesting story overall though. For the limited hardware it's running on, Metroid Other M is pretty impressive in terms of visuals. The graphics are solid, and enemies and characters, while not spectacular, look good for a Wii game. Environments look great and are especially detailed. The game only takes place in one major area, but some VR type effects give the feeling of being in all types of surroundings throughout the game, which changes things up nicely. The frame rate, aside from a few dips here and there, is mostly steady throughout the game, which is actually pretty surprising considering how much goes on screen during some of the larger battles. The thing that really sets this game apart was the amount of stylish effects and visual flair that's packed into almost every situation. It's not too over the top, which is nice, but it's enough to keep the look of things exciting. The audio is pretty much the same story. The music is minimal but effective and really matches each scenario well. The voice acting I'm not really sure about. It isn't bad, that's for sure, but the overdone dialogue unfortunately manages to hinder it a little. Just like the visual effects, the sound effects are great. The sounds of Samus's weapons and equipment are incredibly varied and constantly changing. Sometimes shooters of this type tend to sound a bit repetitive after a few hours of button mashing, but that's definitely not the case here. It's all done very well. Other M was developed by Team Ninja, and the first-person gameplay we've gotten used to is now gone. I was a bit confused as to what they were going for with this game. I'm not sure that even they know exactly. The best way to describe it is side-scrolling gameplay set in 3D environments. Now, the game is not a side-scroller as you can move in all directions, but it sort of feels that way because of the constrained level design. It mostly consists of long corridors attached to individual rooms. The game is played using only the Wiimote, which is held sideways, and you use the D-pad to move and the 1 and 2 buttons to attack and jump. The game plays well enough, but it seems like they got a bit too ambitious and tried to do too much with too little. Basically how the game unfolds is you run through narrow hallways and blast things as you go. The auto-aim system makes this part pretty easy, and the in-between enemies feel more like there's just something to shoot while you're running rather than actual opponents. When you get to the next room, you enter a sort of arena battle with a bunch of smaller enemies and maybe a boss. You clear it out, maybe activate a control panel or something, and then move on. The problem with the large-scale fights are the limited controls. You can only shoot whichever way you're facing, and you almost always need to be moving in order to not get hit, so you sort of have to circle around the room and run straight for the enemies while shooting and then circle back again. When the fights are a bit lengthy or you're in a more confined space, it can feel a little awkward and frustrating. There's also a first-person mode that you'll have to pop into in order to fire off missiles and stuff, and to be honest, it's probably the worst thing that the gameplay has to offer. You can't move while in this mode, the aiming is slow, and unfortunately it's a requirement for most boss battles. Not being able to move while in the middle of being relentlessly attacked, yeah, I don't know what they were thinking. You'll get used to it after a while and it won't be so bad, but to me it never felt right, and like most of the gameplay I always felt like I was being forced to compensate for their poor design choices. There are some minor puzzle elements as well, and some pretty fun morph ball segments that do a good job of breaking up the action, as well as plenty of power-ups to collect along the way, so that's good I guess. The huge variety of enemies and different forms of combat is also a big plus. Where's a bottle when you need one? The game is pretty short. I managed to finish it in about 8 hours. There's more than enough action along the way though, and it's safe to say that they made it count. Obviously it wouldn't be Metroid without some backtracking too, and although it wouldn't have killed them to put some alternate routes instead, it's not as bad as it once was. Outside of the actual story mode, there's not much to be found. There's no online mode, but really I don't see how that would have worked anyway. There's also not much in the way of collectibles or extras, which may disappoint some fans. Overall though, Metroid Other M is a decent amount of fun, and despite my gripes with the gameplay, I think most people shouldn't have too many problems getting through it. That said, would I like to see another Metroid game of this type? Absolutely not. If anything good can come of this game, it's that hopefully it'll serve as a nice enough break for Nintendo, and they'll feel comfortable returning to Metroid Prime. Other M's gameplay just didn't do it for me, and I really can't recommend a purchase. But if you're a fan of the series and the gameplay looks interesting to you, I do think it's worth giving it a try.